The Balfour Declaration of 1917, paving the way to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's Government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
The Balfour Declaration was a major turning point for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and was a major step to the lack of compromise there is today. This declaration forever impacted Palestine and Israel because it paved the way to making Palestine the national home for Jewish people, but felt as a betrayal to the Palestinians from Britain because Britain promised a land that was not theirs, which forever altered the history in the region. The Balfour Declaration was not the first of its kind. Before 1917, there were many events that led up to the famous Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was a public statement that included British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issuing a letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, that promised the land of Palestine to the Zionist movement. The creation of the Balfour Declaration affected four groups of people. It affected the Palestinians, the Zionists, the Jewish people, and the British. In the early 1900s and late 1800s, before the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinians living in Palestine took up around 94% of the land at the time. In the same time period, Jewish people were scattered all over the world but were mostly located in Europe. Zionists, however, wanted an establishment of a Jewish national state in Palestine and wanted later support for the creation of the modern state of Israel. The British, on the other hand, were in the middle of World War I and needed allies to support them. The main problem and controversy with the Balfour Declaration was that the British had promised a territory to the Jewish people that was not theirs, with neglect to the people who had already lived there, which were the Palestinians. As British author and journalist Arthur Koestler once wrote, the main problem was one nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. The Declaration was not a clear or coherent text. It had many internal contradictions, such as the British supporting a right to a self-determination of a minority in Palestine, 60,000 Jewish people, while denying it to the majority, 600,000 Palestinians. This would continue to cause problems for the world to this day. For a long time, the British were interested in the geographical location of Palestine because it was close to the Suez Canal, which was a gateway to the Indian Empire. Also, Britain wanted to side with Zionists so they could encourage other pro-Zionist countries and governments, such as the US and Russia, to stay in the war until they win. Many people from the British government were also Zionists, so they had a strong connection with the Zionist community. Some say the Balfour Declaration was issued to end Britain's Jewish problem and prejudice against the Jewish people in Britain. Although the Balfour Declaration greatly helped one side of the conflict, the Jewish people, it was also controversial for the Palestinians. The Palestinians living there for thousands of years filled up almost all of the land, yet the Balfour Declaration promised the Jewish people their land, which caused Palestinians to be displaced. Before 1915 to be exact, the British had already made a wartime promise, which was the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. This correspondence was an agreement made by a series of letters exchanged between Sir Henry McMahon and Hussein ibn Ali. In this agreement, the British promised assistance in the creation of an independent Arab state, and the Arabs promised reinforcement to British while fighting against the Ottoman Empire. These letters themselves had already had problems and disagreements, but they were later contradicted by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret agreement made between the British and the French in 1916 that split the Ottoman Empire between the two groups. Due to the British's secrecy and deceiving ways, these two controversial agreements ultimately led to the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Another reason why the Declaration caused such a conflict was because the British did not refer to Palestine natives as Palestinians, but instead called them non-Jewish people, which showed they did not acknowledge the existent people living in Palestine. However, the Balfour Declaration was originally intended not to prejudice against non-Jewish people in Palestine, but later, when the British Mandate came into play, it steadily started to establish individual rule for the Jewish people despite the unawareness of Palestinians. Not only were the British involved in the creation of the Balfour Declaration, but so were other allied powers to the British during World War I. Arthur Balfour wanted to see U.S. President Wilson's thought on the Declaration. President Woodrow Wilson read the Declaration's draft twice before it was actually finalized. The Balfour Declaration's creation was received differently by different people. Zionists celebrated as they felt this was their right to have a homeland in Palestine. It transformed their position in the world. It provided approval for the Zionists to work towards their goal of having an independent Jewish state in Palestine. However, some of the Jewish people did not agree. The Central Conference of American Rabbis said that there was no need for a national Jewish homeland. They felt that Jews should feel welcome wherever they practiced their faith and they should contribute to society. Although it was not the British government's intent to cause such a conflict, they issued the declaration without much communication with others already living in the region. This ultimately led to the British Mandate of Palestine. Palestine was a unique case under the Mandate system because they were assured that they would ultimately be granted independence. But Britain's interests were in line with the Zionists, who called for a Jewish state in Palestine and assisted with Jewish immigration. A General Assembly was held in 1947 called by the newly formed UN regarding the partitioning of Palestine between the Palestinians and the Jewish people. The UN was in charge of this because the British decided they did not want to deal with it anymore. The UN would go on to separate Palestine into Jewish and Arab sections, which would further escalate the conflict. The General Assembly voted in favor of the partition. However, Britain did not participate in voting, as well as 10 other members. All of the Arab nations who were a part of the General Assembly staged a walkout to protest against the partition. The partition had major flaws, such as it did not provide for an outside military force to keep order. On May 14, 1948, 6 months after the partition, Israel declared it was an official state.
They wanted to appear they are not siding with anyone or impartial with both sides.
The Palestinians, however, did not agree, and on May 15, 1948, the Palestinian-Israeli War had begun. This was the beginning of many wars that would continue until this day. The First War immediately followed Israel's proclamation of statehood on May 14, 1948. This conflict triggered significant demographic change throughout the Middle East. Approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes in the area that became known as Israel, and they became Palestinian refugees in what they referred to as a Nakba, the catastrophe. In the 3 years following the war, about 700,000 Jewish people immigrated to Israel. Arab and Israeli forces clashed for the third time in June 1967 in what was called the Six-Day War. Israel gained control of the Golan Heights in Syria, Gaza, and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as Jerusalem. In 1987, there was the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising. This was a mass uprising by the Palestinians directed against continued Israeli control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Palestinians were protesting the conditions under the military presence. In 2008 and 2012, the Gaza wars erupted in the area. These were the hardest fought as mostly children died at the expense of Palestinian and Israeli fighting. For political reasons, Arthur Balfour's declaration paved the way for one of the most intense and bitter conflicts in modern history. In the 100 years since the Balfour Declaration, thousands and thousands of people have been hurt or killed in the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Over the last 100 years, none of the past agreements or attempts at peace have ever brought a long and lasting peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. Currently, there is more conflict and despair in the region that has seemed to be the longest conflict in modern-day history. The only way to a true and lasting compromise is when the Palestinians and Israelis can accept that everyone has a right to live in peace and prosperity across the entire country. To understand the present, we have to understand the history.